Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again this week by Joshua Blank, research director of the same project. How are you this beautiful February morning and Valentine's Day?
I'm just basking in the love all around me. You know?
Yeah.
I'm trying to, at least.
Well, I was going to say.
Trying my best.
I know better than that, but okay. We'll leave that be. These midweek Valentine's Day, they're difficult.
Yeah.
Especially if you're an underperforming husband.
Well, I'm just thinking, aren't they all in some way?
Yeah, right. No, I hear you.
Okay.
All right. So enough of that malarkey.
That was the personal portion of the podcast.
Yeah, personal portion of the podcast, The podcast also gives lessons, which is plan better for Valentine's Day, kids.
I think
So the big public event in Texas politics this week is Governor Abbott's State of the State speech, which he'll be delivering this Thursday, February 16th, and we're recording this Tuesday mid-morning. I guess is that all implied. So this Thursday, February 16th at 7 p.m. Central, broadcast or offered for free broadcast and webcast by your friends at Nexstar. And for the second year the second address in a row, I should say, second session in a row, going to give his State of the State address not at the Capitol, but from another location. This time this is being hosted by the Greater San Marcos Partnership and the San Marcos Area Chamber of Commerce. He did it from a little factory space in Lockhart 2 years ago. And, I think this feels very modern and very stage managed, I think, to people. For old timers, it's a little bit of a thing that he's not doing it at the Capitol. But be that as it may, I think we'll probably come back to that in a way.
Well, I was just saying, it's not at the Capitol, but it's also not that far.
No, but
it's not like he's going to some other part of the state to kind of give an address from wherever.
No, it's a decent commute.
It's a comfortable
mansion.
Commute from the mansion,
right? But not in front of a legislative audience.
And I guess what I'm saying is I hadn't really thought about the fact of the close proximity of the two to the Capitol in the sense that the speech is kind of notable for not being at the Capitol more so than being from out in the state, if you will. Anyway.
And and in both. Well, anyway,
Anyway.
So
we
could parse this. As almost anything, we could parse it to an infinite.
If you've listened
probably
to this before,
to the degree of vastly diminishing returns. All that be all that as it may, we thought it'd be a good time to look at Governor Abbott's position vis-a-vis the legislature, vis-a-vis the public, in the wake of his decisive win over Beto O'Rourke in 2022, and we've made a lot of how the interpretation of election results affects the behavior of incumbents and how it's had a material effect in Texas in the last few years. So, we'll get to that. But let's start with where the governor's poll numbers are, which are pretty good, right?
Yeah. So, if we look, we've been polling job approval numbers on Governor Abbott since 2015. And between November of 2015 and March of 2021, over 19 surveys, more Texas voters approved of the job that Abbott was doing than disapproved. Now, when we look at the 9 surveys that we've conducted since March of 2021, 4 saw more voters disapproving than approving, 4 saw more voters approving than disapproving, so the inverse, and 1 was even, so same number share of voters approved and disapproved. And so this is, we've talked about this a couple times on this podcast. Obviously, if you think been a tough time to govern, and ultimately, not only has it been a tough time to govern, but obviously over that time, Abbott, I think, has obviously extended himself further and further out, kind of into, I would say, the Republican primary ether in a way that's, I think, made a lot of Democrats aware of who he is. When we look at the change in his numbers, I want to be clear, a lot of that change is going to be driven by Democrats becoming more familiar with Abbott, independents, would say to some extent, turning off and then turning back on over the course of the pandemic. And then when we get to Republicans, it's a little bit more of a simpler story.
I think we should also say, well, go ahead with that, then I'll jump in.
Okay. So over the lifetime, of this poll, no fewer than 70% of Republicans have expressed approval for Abbott. That's across 28 surveys. Since his election, his numbers have been improving slightly among Republicans. He had 78% approval before the election in June, 80% in August, 86% in October, and 87% in December. This approval has been split basically between those who approve strongly and approve somewhat.
Right.
And that's been pretty consistent, right? Do you want to jump in here?
Well, no, I think I was just, what was occurring to me is one of the things that's interesting in retrospect, and it's the kind of thing I think we've seen before, but it's worth remembering going forward. Mm-hmm. But in the longer term, is that he did lose a little bit of momentum and a little bit of stature with Republicans in that period mid-pandemic that we've talked about.
Yeah.
But I think that also, sent signals to people that turned out to be a little misleading in terms of both Republicans feeling like he might be more vulnerable in a primary. That turned out to not be the case.
Yeah.
And Democrats thinking he might be more vulnerable in the general. That also turned out to not be the case.
I love that.
But it's interesting, to also see that part of that flip was a little bit of a, and I think, he dropped like 10 or 12 points or something among Republicans in mid to late 2021, even really just kind of summer and
when he basically
fall. And as you said, that was a tough time to govern.
Well, basically, two things. Interesting. Yeah, that was when he was taking the pandemic more seriously than was, let's say the president. And really when the president kind of said, okay, states, do what you're going to do. And Abbott kind of was actually kind of pretty serious at that point, and then before kind of he got into conflict with the locals about how far to go, and kind of went down that direction for a while.
Well, and to be that happened, and also I think he as you imply, he and his team put their fingers to the wind and saw which way the wind was blowing in the Republican Party.
Well, and then to just go back to what you just said there about kind of the elite interpretation of that, and I was thinking actually about kind of the public opinion swing there, and I think one of the things that people sort of assume is that like these changes are going to be durable. I think when you're in the space and you watch it closely, there's this idea, and I feel like I hear it all the time, where it's like, something happens, whatever it might be, and it could be like, well, Abbott goes out too far on, or not far enough on COVID restrictions, or, say like the Dobbs decision comes down. And there's this expectation that, one, there's going to be this dramatic shift. And it's like, well, look, first of all, people kind of know what they think generally about these things. So the amount of swing is going to be limited. And then to the extent that like, someone like Abbott sees like a decline of his job approval among Republicans of like 10 points, most of it going to kind of like, I'm not sure, not disapproval.
Yeah.
Well, look, he's still a Republican. He still has a very, very effective political operation. He still is, probably the most powerful elected official in the state. That's debatable, right? We'll get to that in a second. He's one of the most powerful elected officials in the state. It doesn't take a lot of work to get those 10% back into your column. Right. And I think that's kind of what people...
Yeah, and if you're very... events can overtake you. It's the nature of things. But if you're politically skilled and you've got the resources and the tools and the institutional positioning at your disposal, and you're very attentive to these things, which, whatever you want to say about Governor Abbott and his team, they are very attentive to his positioning with the public.
Right. So... other things that we found in polling that I think, sets his kind of context in place, looking at policy positions, we asked in October of last year whether voters approved or disapproved of the job Abbott was doing across 11 different issue areas. And among Republicans, no fewer than 57% of the job approved of the job he was doing across all 11 issue areas. And that 57% was for climate change. If we take climate change out, the floor for Abbott among Republicans was 67% approval across everything. And the lowest one was for his handling of abortion access. We could parse that on its own. His strongest areas among Republicans, immigration and the border, he had 88% of approval, crime and public safety, 84%, and the economy, 82%.
Roughly speaking, the issues most salient to Republicans in polling during that same period.
Absolutely. And so, not surprising then, no more than 50% approval on any of these issues, once we conclude Democrats and independents into the mix.
Right.
Climate change becomes one of the lowest issue areas, abortion access, and the electric grid, which all receive less than 40% approval. But I think the broader point here is that among the majority of the voters in the party that is electing all of the elected seats, he's sitting pretty, among the issues that matter.
Yeah, and the other bookend of those areas where his approval numbers are the lowest, those are the areas that were by and large pretty salient to Democrats, where they have intensely formed and, heavily cued attitudes.
Right, and that's a trade. I mean, the reality is Abbott can be a little bit, maybe, let's just say a little farther to the right of the median Republican on a couple of those issues, and he's still in a pretty sweet spot, relative to the electorate overall.
Well, and speaking of, your relative positioning, he's, we can also talk about how he looks compared to other actors and, anybody. Again, one of those moments where if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't need an explanation of how contentious is actually not the right word, about how heavily freighted the relationship with the other key figure in the state, Dan Patrick, has been for the governor.
I was thinking maybe strategic, the relationship.
Yeah, I was, strategic passed through my mind, I thought, but it's not quite.
No, it needs a little more.
And I need a little, openly contentious is not quite right. I think it is often actually contentious behind the scenes, but to be fair to what the public sees, that contention, you have to be paying attention.
You have to be paying a lot of attention.
The semiotics of that are complicated and require the right filter. But nonetheless, we can look at his standing relative to other actors, particularly the lieutenant governor, and it does tell us something kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for much of Abbott's tenure, he's obviously maintained a significantly higher profile than the lieutenant governor, being that he's the governor. But, after 3 elections in the beginning of each's 5th session in the executive branch, the gap has really narrowed between these two. So first to say, the share of voters with no opinion, I just sort of picked kind of 3 time points just to kind of illustrate the point. So in October of 2016, 25% of Texas voters had no opinion of Abbott, couldn't register a positive or negative view, 38% for Patrick. Jump ahead 2 years to October 2018, Abbott goes down to 17%. So 1 in 4 voters, in 2016 didn't have an opinion about Abbott and went down to 17% in 2018. Patrick's dropped to 25%, so from 38 to 25. We jumped to December 2022, only 10% of voters don't have a view of Abbott. 21% don't have a view of Patrick. So 1 in 10 versus 1 in 5. But what you can see is there's a consistent pattern going on, which has been about a 10-point gap throughout in terms of the fact that as we've gone along, not surprisingly, Abbott's name ID has gone up. A lot of that has been because Democrats and independents have started to develop negative views. This is also true of Patrick.
Right.
And so what you end up seeing is, they're not as far apart really as they used to be. And it's not even that they're not as far apart as they used to be. They're as far apart as they used to be. But the share of people not holding an opinion anymore is becoming, I'll say this, potentially structurally insignificant in the sense that if you don't really have a view of the governor, you don't really have a view of the lieutenant governor, are you like a registered voter who turns out in midterm elections?
Yeah.
Do you show up in Republican primaries? No.
Well, and one thing, another way to kind of look at that is, well, actually, you're going to do Republican approval.
Yeah, I'll just do the Republican approval, get out of this data for a second. So anyway, if we look same time period, we look at Abbott's approval among Republicans. In October 2016, he had 75% approval, 42% strong. 2018, it was 89%, 69% strong. And again, after sort of some waves and some peaks and valleys, December 22, he's still at 89% job approval. But here, only 48% strong. So in October 2018, 69% strong approval. December 2022, 48% strong approval. So that's sort of the intensity. And again, governing makes you make decisions, and ultimately, Republicans can still be approving, but not as strongly so at this point. For Patrick, it's about, started about 20-point gap. Abbott, again, 75% approval in 2016. Patrick was at 56%. In 2018, again, Abbott was at 89. Patrick got up to 77%, so big jump. And again, December 22, Abbott's at 89, Patrick's at 77. So Patrick, again, still, if you kind of, outside of Donald Trump, you're not going to get much higher name ID and positive name ID, and really not even much higher among Republican voters for anybody. And Patrick's not far off the pace at this point, to be honest.
Yeah, it's not a great comparison, but if you did want to, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you wanted to compare that in the broader universe in the way that you're implying, look at John Cornyn's numbers. Right. John Cornyn in a lot of ways, he doesn't need to. No. But, push come to shove, he wouldn't kill for these numbers because I think Cornyn is comfortable where he is. But there have been times when, Cornyn would probably appreciate Patrick-like numbers. Yeah,
I think Cornyn would trade numbers with Patrick.
So, and then the other, something I would add to that after we talked about this before he came up here, I went and looked at a couple other things. And, one of the subterranean issues here, or just not even that subterranean, just barely subsurface issues here, has been the contention over how each is viewed by Republican primary voters
Right.
and most specifically within those primary voters, the most conservative voters in the state, right? So I was looking at, just our most recent December 22 numbers broken down by intensity of conservatism, and it's interesting. In December, in that December poll, just among those who identified as extremely
So
conservative.
the most conservative in our measure.
Right, which is a relatively small
3 point. I mean, it's
pocket
Yeah.
of the party and of the populace, but not insignificant. But obviously the target audience for these guys a lot of time. I mean, I think you have to assume that if what we think the dynamic here a lot of the time is that both the governor and the lieutenant governor wanting to make sure that the other doesn't get too far to the right.
Yeah.
Which gets you kind of stutter stepping over time pretty far to the right, as we've seen. And still, and the rap on Governor Abbott during the 2022 primary was that he wasn't conservative enough.
Right.
But as of December, among these extreme conservatives, his approval rating was 90%, 60% strong approval. Patrick was comparable, 50, but a little lower, 52%, 30%. And so I think, one might expect, given the way each projects and given how they're positioned institutionally, that Patrick would have, if there was going to be an area where Patrick would have an advantage, it might be here, and it's not.
Yeah.
They're just closer to parity.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting to say, the thing that I think, the story that I take away from this and sort of preparing for this discussion and kind of thinking about is, okay, what do you take away from this? Like, one, okay, first and foremost, Abbott's numbers aren't as strong as they were before, but that's among mostly people that he's not trying to get, whose votes he's not competing for.
Right.
Number one. He stands in a very strong position among Republicans. I could say, as strongly as Trump ever probably stood. And in terms of the relative approval ratings, I think they look pretty good. I mean, generally speaking, he's got more strong approval than somewhat approval for most of this among Republicans. The interesting thing in this and about this dynamic we're talking about is the fact that Patrick has been slowly catching up.
Right.
He's not there, but to the extent that he's used his position and used his tenure in office and used I think his skill set well. You're seeing him, at this point now, this idea of, these two guys are kind of in competition with each other, which I think can be overblown. I mean, like a lot. But to the extent that they're over, in a competition over agenda control, credit claiming, that piece of it.
Yeah.
It's whereas before you'd say, I would give Patrick the edge on like raw political skills because he came up through the Senate and the legislative process a little bit.
And talk radio.
And Abbott certainly had sort of the resource skill and the position, right? And the name ID and that kind of the bully pulpit piece of it. But now, it's like that those distinctions are a little bit less. Abbott's better politically and Patrick is a little bit more well-known and has figured out how to use, his office to at least, get his profile in a similar space.
Right.
And so it's making, again, I don't necessarily think they're in competition as much or in the way that people say they are, but it sort of looks like more of a fair fight now. In some ways.
Yes. I mean, I think the competition between them is, I probably have a stronger sense of that or put a little more into that than you do. But I think that point in terms of where they are right now is interesting. We'll talk a little bit about their political future maybe before we get out of here, each of theirs. But, going back to the state of the state. So, I think you've done a good job of kind of posing where Abbott stands, which is in pretty good shape going into the state of the state. So what is the institutional setup? I think it's in terms of the way that we look at the different domains and try to, at least reflect a little bit of political science here and there. This is a period where the governor has some public leverage to inflect the agenda. And, we talk to students about this. It's in the textbook. It's in, all of these different things. But it's worth recapping that, going into the state of the state, the governor has the option, and I think everybody expects that he will declare some emergency items. And as we've explained before, the notion of emergency items comes out of the Constitution. If the governor declares certain areas of legislation emergency items, they are exempted from some aspects of the constitutional order, and it enables the legislature to consider these bills sooner, right? Simply put. And so this is an area where the governor does have potential influence. Now, there are times when the governors in the past, including Governor Abbott, have declared things emergency items and the legislature has more or less ignored it.
Yeah.
Kind of depends on what the flow of politics is at the time. That's what people will be watching for in the process. I mean, they'll watch it in terms of the rhetoric, et cetera. But what people will start taking notes on is when he starts elaborating emergency items.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean, again, I don't want to, and then the governor then, his position to some degree recedes. Now, obviously, institutionally, his ability to veto legislation, which are pretty extensive, including line item vetoes, hovers over the process. And the governor and his staff, and particularly this governor, play, a pretty prominent role that's not very public.
Yeah.
In terms of people proposing legislation and people taking the temperature of the governor with his legislative staff in terms of, how the governor views what they're doing and what the governor's priorities are and what his, and what he will not consider.
Right. There's no advantage to any of the governing coalition to have the legislature seeming to be seriously consider a bill from the majority Republican Party to have the governor publicly issue a veto threat.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't do anything for anybody.
Yeah. And, and look, I mean, I think if that happens, it's usually, there's something going on.
Well, right. If it is, it's a very clear decision to do that.
And of course, the other power the governor has here that doesn't make manifest, isn't making manifest now and is really, if you've got the emergency items as kind of a high point of agenda inflection at the beginning of the process or near the beginning of the process, at the end it becomes a threat of a special session.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think, all of this in my mind is like, this is sort of the opening chapter, and we're going to move on in a little bit to sort of to Patrick's priorities, which is the other part of this, which is, going back to where we were starting on this a little bit. I mean, this is kind of the beginning, really to me, this is like the opening salvo in sort of this question of, who is going to get responsibility for the successes and blame for the failures of the session, right? And this is where Abbott gets to make, his first big statement of the session saying, these are my priorities. And he can now say for the next, couple months, these were my priorities for the legislature.
Right.
And either they followed through on what I told them to do.
Right.
Or they didn't.
This, should the governor want it to, this will come back at the end when we start talking about bargaining over a special session and things like this. So, so let's, a little bit. So, what is the substance of what the governor seems to want and why? Now, we've talked a lot about his campaign themes, and I think pretty straightforwardly, the governor's been very vocal about wanting, like everyone else, at least in the leadership of the Republican Party, about wanting some kind of property tax relief.
Right.
He's been very direct. I'll be shocked if border security is not seen as an emergency item. Now, that's front-loaded since there's been no pushback on more border security spending in the preliminary budgets. So, hard to imagine we're not going to see that. And then I think, there's the question of, where does he pick and choose in the mixture of things that we've been talking about a lot since the election, but certainly since the election was over, between the kind of very broadly speaking governance, eco-devo, economic development bucket, and, the red meat locker.
Yeah, that's great. I love that because I'm sitting here like I'm kind of writing as you're talking about thing, and the first thing I wrote was all right, property taxes. Okay, next one's like border, right? And then I have like kind of this. I'm like, well, you could on one side you could imagine the electric grid. You could imagine broader discussions about infrastructure that people are talking about with the surplus and given that. And then there's another bucket which I say like he could talk about something having to do with education.
Right.
And when I say something like and what, I'm not sure. It could be about. It could be about, kids who are transgender. It could be about vouchers. It could be about parental rights. It could be about all of those things.
It could also be school safety.
Then that would almost fall more. Yeah, that's an interesting sort of in between.
Right? I guess what I'm realizing is I should have had an intermediate bucket there. Probably.
Well, and the truth is, nothing stops him from doing all these things, really. I mean, but I think what's interesting is, and given the fact that to your point, this largely reflects the themes of the campaign. It reflects the priorities of Republican voters, and especially Republican primary voters. And I think we'll get a sense even more when we see what the list is sort of where the relative weight of this stuff is. I mean, we had a podcast last week and we wrote a piece about sort of the relationship of the business community to the Republican Party. And it's interesting. I mean, we know property taxes and the border those are in there in some way, shape, or form. Whether they're an emergency item or not, they have pride of place. But then it's like, you start to think about like, okay, what is next right now? Are we going after woke businesses? Are we trying to like elevate these issues that are very, very mobilized in and around the suburbs and like sort of school board elections and things like that? Or is this a time to talk about broadband expansion and infrastructure and 313 incentives? These are like, what's the direction?
And I think, we've been talking the last few weeks about all of these things that are sort of appearing on the table to set the stage for the bargaining to come.
Right.
And this is going to be an interesting, this is going to be a big part of the table setting, which of those things appear. And so, we might as well like crank out what's going on. So, the other, more inside baseball event this week, although, the media is picking it up.
They've been waiting.
Was certainly inside the Beltway,
right,
in Austin anyway, people have been waiting to see, how the lieutenant governor was going to fill out the first 30 bills that were reserved for priority bills on the Senate side. And, I'm as we were talking before the podcast, no accident of timing.
Yeah.
The lieutenant governor has released his list of priorities. And, a little bit of context here before we talk about, this list, which is kind of a, in terms of the buckets we were just talking about, it's kind of a kitchen sink list. Within the universe that we're talking about. But it is interesting, we've talked about the governor's positioning. As Lieutenant Governor said in some of the verbiage accompanying the release of these 30 bills, these that are really just subject lines at this point. It used to be like they'd reserve 20.
Yeah.
A couple sessions ago, Lieutenant Governor thought it was appropriate to start reserving 30.
Yeah.
This is released right as the governor is going to declare, I think last time there were a half dozen emergency items.
Yeah.
So there's 30 things. You can knock a couple of these out. SB 1 is the budget because the budget's this year. The budget's originating on the Senate side.
And you can group some of these together.
You can group some of these. SB 30 is the supplemental. That's just a function of, again, it being a year where the budget process is starting on the Senate side. But in between, you've got a lot of options that will absolutely be compared to the governor's emergency items the moment we know what those are.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly why Patrick released them, as he did. And it's interesting. I mean, going back to how we were talking about looking at the views of Republicans. I mean, with the release of these priorities, the statement said, from Patrick, said that these proposals, are going to be supported by Texans, and he said, quote, because they largely reflect the policy supported by the conservative majority of Texans, which I love because, I mean, to some extent, as a public opinion guy, it's like, this is what we've been talking about. It's like, look, you just have to look at Republican voters. And even so, you should really look at the most conservative Republican voters.
Right.
And here it's just like, these are the priorities of, are going to be supported because the majority, a majority of the voters in the majority coalition are going to support these policies.
And, look, when you have 28 bills to play with, you get a lot of breath.
Yes, you do.
A lot of room to run. So, like, on one hand, you've got, around the middle of the list, Senate Bill 9 and Senate Bill 10, empowering teacher rights, a teacher pay raise, adding a 13th check for retired teachers.
Right.
It keeps going through the we were talking about education. And this really does underline what you were talking about. What will the education items, and whether they're emergency items or not, what will the education portion of Governor Abbott's speech look like? And if you look at, for those of you following along at home, if you look at the list of items, Senate Bill 8 through, roughly 15, roughly 17 or 18 encompass education if you go K through 12 and higher ed. And they range from these teacher pay issues, but through things like protecting children from obscene books in libraries, ending child gender modification, protecting women college sports, banning critical race theory in higher education, and a favorite of many of my colleagues here, eliminating tenure at general academic institutions, among other things, right? That really gives you a sense of, even within education, there's a lot of room to roam here.
I think you know this, and I think you'll back me on this. I don't usually point out when I was right about things. I'm pretty good. I mean, like partially because we work in a probabilistic business, so I generally just am like, I'm reaching into one of those urns and pulling out a ball, so I'm kind of like, I have to be reasonable about this. But I've been kind of talking about the how crowded the education space is. And if you do what you just did and you say, okay, there's 30 bills here, and if I go here, I go from 8 to 19 involve education. Now, some of those are higher ed, some of those are public ed, but almost a third of these are education-related bills.
Right.
That's a lot. That's like, this is, it's really, this does kind of lay out. And the fact that they're all priorities is like, well, they can't all be priorities. Priority is actually a singular word anyway. So and
there's an interesting, there's an interesting dynamic, House-Senate dynamic here.
Well, that's
to digress slightly on
that.
No,
let's talk about that.
In that we have, an experienced ally of the lieutenant governor.
Mm-hmm.
Ally's not quite the right word probably, but in the education chair and a unified education chair that has authority over education and higher ed in the Senate.
Right.
Senator Brandon Creighton. And you're going to have a first-time education chair, higher ed chair in the House.
Yep.
And so, the dynamic there is going to be interesting. I think a lot of these are going to have very tough sledding in the House.
And this is what's going to be interesting. We were talking about this earlier, and we sort of, to be sort of social sciencey, as you'd already raised it, there's something sort of, I think about game theory in the sense of, we call this a repeated game, right? Yeah. All the players go in, they know what's going to happen. But the thing is, if you play a game over and over again, you got to adjust your strategies, right? And you have to adjust your strategies not only because you learn, but because you're assuming the other side is adjusting their strategies, right? And I've already talked about kind of like, my take of like Abbott's dynamic a little bit. And, we're going to see the beginning of this week where he gets to say, okay, go do these things. He can take an extreme position. He says, let's cut property taxes by $70 billion. It doesn't, and ultimately he could say any number he wants because the legislature will get wherever they're going to get. And he can say, look what I got for you, right? But the thing is, Patrick knows this now. And the thing is, when Patrick had his big priority list back with the bathroom bill, Abbott came in and in the special session, he basically scooped up that list, made it the special session agenda, and then took credit for what they were able to pass.
And then blamed them for what they weren't able to pass.
So one of the things that I think people have been pointing out is an interesting thing to watch in this sort of very inner dynamic is like, okay, so is the pacing. Right. I mean, Patrick obviously has the ability to make this legislation move basically. And again, this legislation doesn't even exist yet. But to the extent that it will exist very soon, he can make it move pretty much as fast as he wants it to within the Constitution.
And they moved his priorities very rapidly and very purposefully last session.
Right. Within constitutional limits.
Yeah.
Okay. But then the question becomes,
But remember, we are talking about the Senate.
Well, right. Okay. So they go and let's say they just run through in the first, 100 days, they knock out all 30 of these and they send them all to the House. Now, first of all, as you point out, the House may have just a functional problem processing all this stuff with the committee makeup and ideological whatever, right? But I guess what I'm starting to think about is like, what's better or worse for Patrick? Is it better to send all this stuff to the House and have them screw it up, or to try to like maybe even prioritize within this list to try to make, try to get as much as you can out of this? Because one of the things, knowing that Abbott's sitting there on the side and he's going to take credit for stuff, but he's also going to point to the things you didn't do.
Right.
Is it worth it to you to send a bunch of stuff to the House to then have them not pass some of it out of backlash? Which, I mean, honestly, like that's kind of what has been happening lately, to then basically end up being the foil that Abbott's waiting for. Yeah. And so I'm kind of, it's what's the next stage of this is sort of the...
Well, and I also, as part of that equation, I'd be remiss, particularly with our listeners that are, creatures of the legislature. You can't also underestimate the degree to which, the games are linked, but this is also an iterative game with a speaker.
Right.
And a speaker in which there is, clearly a level of antagonism between the speaker and the lieutenant governor right now that goes beyond the pre-programmed, institutional tension between the House and the Senate.
So no this is a joke, I should say before I say. So no indication from you that the speaker and the lieutenant governor are banding up so that they can, be a better counterweight to the governor and the agenda space.
Well, I was at an off-the-record event, so I can't share details last night at the TLIP roast of State Representative Sinfronia Thompson, in which all of the last 6 speakers, including the current speaker, got up and roasted each other and Miss Thompson. I would say that there was, a lot of stray fire also aimed at the lieutenant governor. We'll leave it at that. So I don't think that there's been any repair.
Yeah.
And look, I don't think either one of them has worked at all to hide that. I mean, we've talked on the podcast before about at an on the record event, Speaker Phelan, when asked by Evan Smith, the interview at the Tribune Festival in the fall, whether, he thought that they would be resuming the breakfast between the big three, and I think a lot of those the comptroller was at. And he, if they'd been doing that, and he was like, the speaker just kind of pretty good stage pause and said, I'm not a big breakfast eater.
I think he said something else, and that was like, our staffs talk regularly.
Yeah, right. Stuff like that. So, all right. So, to wind this up. So what are we looking for? You know what? Before we wind this up, I do want to flag something, just its continuity with some previous things we talked about. I think it is also interesting, and it is something that I'll be watching for pretty closely in the state of the state, because, it seems like it's something that has been bubbling up, and that is, Senate Bill 28 is addressing Texas's future water needs.
Yeah.
You mentioned infrastructure going through, and it's hard not to wonder whether there's going to be follow through on that in terms of, this discussion of water, that started to appear, I think, at a very low profile in the electoral season, but pretty quickly afterwards, you started seeing this discussion of water kind of popping up, and I'm gonna be interested to see if that's a point of, if that's a shared point, and I'm sure, given what we've seen, that the governor will mention it. I'll be interested to see if water is an emergency item.
So as long as we're doing a little thing, I'll add to that and just say, I'm curious, given the continuity of the discussion we've been having, when they just what the vehicle for I'm curious what the vehicle for increasing the reliability of the electric grid looks like.
Yeah.
Given the set of attitudes that we've been talking about towards business generally.
Right.
Because ultimately, yes, the oil and gas industry has a certain pride of place and is lionized in Texas in a certain way. However, I got to say, sitting here and looking at the data that we collected in December towards businesses generally, I know what Democrats are going to say about the oil and gas industry. No problem. I pretty much have a sense of what independents are going to be leaning. They're probably going to lean in the Democratic direction, I think, in most cases. What do Republican attitudes towards the oil and gas industry in Texas look like right now? And to the extent that we come out of this session, what kind of resources do the oil and gas industry get out of this, and what kind of reaction do we see from that?
Yeah,
is there a lot of room for that?
And this is where we should plug the piece that we did last week, or I think we rolled it out Friday, so we're going to call it, it's a piece for this week.
Yeah, sure.
In which we went through a lot of that data on attitudes towards business. And, to your point, remember what we did is we asked the poll respondents, do you think, business and corporations are doing too much, too little, or about the right amount in response to the following? The top too much response among Republicans was climate change.
And LGBTQ rights.
Right, and LGBTQ rights. So, that both of those things, but in terms of what we're talking about, very interesting.
It's a very, at this point to me, it seems a kind of an unsettled space.
Well, I guess what I would say, I think, again, God, a lot of social science in this podcast. I don't know what's going on here.
Take a shower.
But I think part of that is that reflects, one, the massive complexity of a problem that people experienced in a non-complex way. In other words, this is on people's radar because a bunch of people huddled in the dark with the lights out when it was very cold a couple of years ago, and have not, and are still, and recently have seen some other things.
And every time the lights go out now, they're reminded of
Right.
it.
And so there's that. But the area, within the policy area, like a lot of big complex areas like this that include these multiple big sectors with a lot of influence in the system, there's not elite consensus right now on what to do about this. In fact, there is a big, ongoing policy fight in which, essentially the first effort to solve this, or not to solve it, but to address it in the process has not really worked out. In other words, PUC came up with a proposal using some consultants, and that proposal is not really being accepted as is, right? And so I think that is exacerbating this, in terms of, the classic model of complex policy issue, public, that reaches a degree of salience with the public. They look to elites for clear guidance, for partisan cues, and Republicans are actually fighting among themselves. I mean, there's no consensus among Republicans, including to date among the big three. And so,
well, and I'm sitting here thinking to myself, as someone who sits on the public opinion side, knowing that people's, opinions about this are relatively, pretty constrained and pretty limited. But if I think, if we get to the back end of this and we're, polling in late, let's say in April or March, and we're asking about, some kind of multi-billion-dollar seed money for an infrastructure bank for the oil and gas industry, I don't know if that's going to get a good reception among the public.
Well, in our polling, that is one of those things where, as people always say to us, well, you could have asked that differently.
Absolutely. Totally.
I think that's an artifact of what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
right?
No. Well, but I mean, but to your point, I think the thing is what's interesting about that, it is definitely a reflection of how you ask it. But to make the point, the sort of other considerations that one might bring to bear on this that may or may not influence the question at this point, they're all pretty heavy, right? So it's these sort of orientations towards business, orientation towards state supportiveness. It's also climate change. And so there's a lot of things that can kind of get into that space that can kind of, I think, normally I would say yes.
A lot of competing frames that aren't going to relate directly to whatever the policy proposal on the table is, which is going to be massively complex no matter. I mean, there's going to be a couple hundred people in the state that fully understand what is going on there.
But that's actually what creates all the space,
right? Exactly,
to shape opinion, in a way that I think in this case I'd normally say yes, the question matters. Maybe it shifts things a couple points here or there. But when you start thinking about what else? We start to think about the ways people are going to message test this and work with it. I could see, there's going to be a lot of flux in this.
Yeah. So we'll almost certainly spend at least part of the next week podcast, as long as we're all, we all survive the next week, parsing this. So to round up, a few things to kind of, like questions going into this, and maybe we'll come back to these, clearly, as we've said, in terms of the state level politics and the legislative process, what are those emergency items going to be? What gets, relative pride of place? How much real estate do different topics get in the speech? And then on to, a matter of speculation that we really talked about a lot. We don't have to come back to this. We're going to wind up having to talk about it next week, so there's no point getting into it too much right now. But, how much do the themes that the governor articulates and how much of the style in which he articulates them, tap into very familiar, prominent national political discussions right now? How does Abbott balance these traditional economic development kind of themes, and we've hit on this already, but with the more, provocative, and I would say, to some degree, and it's fair, I think even some of the more reactionary themes that are really front and center for so many Texas and national Republicans right now, and are front and center on Lieutenant Governor Patrick's list. How does that all shake out? And then how does this feed the speculation about what the governor's plans are for the future? Yeah. And by extension, kind of every other statewide official and Republican political entrepreneur in the place. So it's going to be a very loaded kind of moment, I think. Now, we're dorking out on this. Most Texans will not pay very much attention. But, that's what we do.
Yep, so that's what you're here for.
All right. So thanks for being here, Josh. Fun conversation, at least for us. We'll see how the listeners respond, if at all. Thanks again, as always, to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. We'll post some of the polling that we've talked about in a blog post at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.